The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
We are back, and thank you for coming into the House of Mystery. Tonight we have David Dekok. I want to thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I'm sure it's going to be great.
Oh, it always is.
Yeah.
So now you haven't been on the show before. So
I have not.
Yeah, no. So let's tell us a little bit about you, where you got your start, and how you got into writing.
Well, I grew up in Holland, Michigan, and I went to Hope College there, and majored in political science. But I always really wanted to be a journalist. They didn't have a journalism program at Hope College, so I got my training working on the college newspaper, and then after I graduated, I got a job at a small newspaper in Pennsylvania called the News Item, and I did reporting on many different types of stories there, but in particular, the one that really stuck with me was on the Centralia mine fire, which was an underground fire that had destroyed or was in the process of destroying this little town called Centralia, and I wrote a lot of stories about that for the paper, and then wrote my first book, Unseen Danger, about that, and then a number of years later I updated the book, and it's now called Fire Underground. It's kind of a comprehensive history of that. And then I worked for the Harrisburg Patriot News in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the state capital, and it was when I was coming to the end of my time there in 2008 that I decided I wanted to do a story about the Betsy Aardsma case, and so because it was getting more and more attention, from various citizen, investigators. That's kind of what I call them, but they were looking into the case because the state police in Pennsylvania had basically not done anything on it for years. This unsolved murder, and so that was how I got into writing what became the book Murder in the Stacks, and that's kind of it.
Yeah. Did you sort of, so you had an affinity, you're sort of into true crime and that sort of thing as a hobby more than anything?
Well, actually, no. I mean, I had read, books now and then, on true crime, let's say, Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, but I can't really say that I was a devotee of it. And now I realize that I really like, writing about this. But back then it was kind of a new thing that grew out of my abilities as an investigative reporter, which, could be investigating, just about anything, from environmental, disasters and crimes to, utility fraud or anything like that. And, so it was kind of a natural outgrowth of my investigative reporting, for the Harrisburg paper.
Right. And so what made you lock on to this story in particular?
Well, Betsy Aardsma was from my hometown of Holland, Michigan. And she was 6 years older than me. We went to the same high school, but because of the age difference, we didn't know each other, although, we had teachers in common, and my younger sister is a friend of her younger sister, that sort of thing. But I distinctly remember, back in Thanksgiving weekend of 1969, seeing the Holland Evening Sentinel, the paper, and on the top of page one, there was a story about this girl named Betsy Aardsma, very pretty, being murdered in Pattee Library at Penn State, and I stayed with the story and never really forgot about it, but it wasn't really again until I was well into my career that I actually had a chance to write about it. But yeah, it was the hometown connection that got me into it.
Right. And so now the hometown was quite small, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, it was 25,000. I guess you could still call that small. But it was a small town, kind of in the best sense of the word. It was very Dutch, Dutch American. It had been settled by Dutch religious dissidents beginning in 1848, and it was right along Lake Michigan. It was a very pretty, well-kept town, but very much of a monoculture, and lots of blonde people.
So now in the town itself, so it was a fairly clean, nice town and everything. So there wasn't a lot of murders or things going on there either.
There were not a lot of murders. Those that did occur tended to be outsiders, people kind of on the fringes of the community. The only one that wasn't was in the early '60s when this local boy murdered two young girls who were out walking in the sand dunes along Lake Michigan and picking flowers. He claimed he shot them accidentally, but could never explain how he shot them accidentally 11 times. And then he tried to flee by hitchhiking. He went up to the top of the lower peninsula of Michigan, and then hitchhiked into the upper peninsula, and then got all the way out to the Badlands of South Dakota before a local sheriff recognized him from a wanted bulletin that had gone out and arrested him and took him back, and then he was tried and convicted and was in prison until he committed suicide.
Oh. That must have been kind of shocking,
It was because it was so out of character for the town. This was not a town where good people worried at all, that they might be murdered by some crazy, nutcase. It was just a classic small town. I mean, there was crime, but it was controllable crime for the most part. This was really out of character.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. This was probably even the murder here of Betsy in '69. So now you were a few years younger than her, right? So you were still in school when it happened?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So how did it affect the school and the community?
Well, from what her one source in particular, who was friends with the family, told me that they were. It was not like a warm embrace that they received. I mean, Holland is can be a very cold town. It's a very Calvinist town because of the majority religions, Protestant religions that are practiced there. And Betsy's younger sister told her friend that no teacher mentioned it to her. That friends didn't mention it to her. It was almost considered like it was something shameful that had happened to her sister, and nobody talked about it.
Wow. I would think isn't that kind of unusual for 1969?
It is unusual, but Holland is an unusual place in that respect. I mean, the Calvinist religion, actually there's the Reformed Church and the Christian Reformed Church, and especially the Christian Reformed Church was just very dour and austere. And so while what happened there may, to her younger sister may seem almost shocking to us, it's not all that unusual there. I mean, they were just very different people. Wow. So now,
did that affect the crime, as in the way that they, let's say, policed it, where they investigated it?
Well, the crime itself took place at Penn State University in Pennsylvania, not in Holland, Michigan.
Okay. Yeah.
But the Pennsylvania State Police did send troopers out to Holland to find out what they could about Betsy Aardsma. I mean, basically when police investigate a murder like this, one of their classic techniques is to look for some kind of moral flaw in the victim that will lead them to the person who committed the murder. But in their case, they couldn't find anything. She was a good girl. She was, clean as a whistle, really. She was pretty. She was, graduated fourth in her class in high school. And the ones that I talked to, they expressed frustration that she made it so hard for them by being so good.
Wow. And what exactly, okay, let's go over the murder a little bit. So what were the kind of the details of the murder?
She had gone to Pattee Library at Penn State at around 4:30 in the afternoon. Her roommate went along with her, and then they split at the front door of the library, and Betsy then walked back to an adjoining faculty office building to talk to one of her English professors. And then she went into the library to look for a particular book that her professor had wanted to see to help grade a paper that she had written. And it was while she was in the stacks, in the second level stacks of the library, that she had an encounter with someone. I believe it was the killer, Richard Haefner, and she was stabbed once in the chest and died almost instantly.
Wow. So now, was there a reason why he would do this to her that you kind of became aware of?
Well, they knew each other. They actually lived in the same dormitory. It was actually Penn State's first co-ed dorm that year in 1969. They were both graduate students, and he was obsessed with her. They had gone out on very casual, get-togethers, 2 or 3 times, basically just for coffee or things like that. And then she figured out that he was a creep and dumped her. Now she had a boyfriend at this time, but throughout her teenage years, she had always been very open to friendships with men, even if she was dating somebody else. And so Haefner didn't like that. But he didn't do anything about it until November 28th of 1969. Now, how he found out she was in the library that day is unclear. It may have been this fellow, Larry Paul Maurer, who was in the same English class as Betsy and who also fancied Betsy. I sometimes wonder whether this was all a terrible prank that went horribly wrong. But anyway, he was down there reading his pornography, and she came along. There was some kind of an encounter, a silent encounter, really. And then seconds later, 3 people who were within 10 or 20 feet of where she was standing in the stacks heard the sound of books falling, and one of them actually did hear a sound like a fist hitting a chest, but there was no scream, no argument, anything like that. It all happened very quickly, and then the man came running out of the stacks and almost immediately came upon Marilee Erdley and Joao Wafinda, 2 of the 3 people, and he kind of stops and he says, "Somebody better help that girl," but it wasn't going to be him. He kept on going.
Wow. And so now how did this end up in trial? Like, so did they end up catching him, or did they just not even bother solving the crime?
No, I mean, they made every effort to solve the crime, but they were never successful. And a big part of the reason for that was that people who knew or suspected that Haefner, had something to do with the murder stayed quiet. And notably, this was his professor, Professor Lauren Wright. Professor Wright had been Haefner's thesis advisor in the geology department, and he was at home, in his home in State College, with his wife at the time the murder took place. And then an hour afterward, Haefner shows up at his front door and is all out of breath and kind of agitated. And the first thing he says is there anything in the paper about that girl being killed in the library? And Wright knew nothing about this. And he talked to Haefner for a while, and then Haefner left. And Wright told me that he wondered about this, but he never said anything to anybody, even at the time, even in the weeks to come when there were as many as 40 Pennsylvania State troopers on campus interviewing, 2,500 to 3,000 students and faculty about this, and Lauren Wright never says anything about his student. And it wasn't until maybe 7 years later that Lauren Wright, who was feeling at that point threatened by Haefner, went to his department chairman and poured out this story. The department chairman then went to the university general counsel and said, "Hey, you might have the killer Betsy Aardsma here," and nothing ever happened. The lead investigator for the Pennsylvania State Police said that he had never heard anything about any of this, and I believe him. And the state police were just really stymied. There were a number of problems besides Lauren Wright. There was the whole issue of the 1960s. The student protests and everything like that. the Pennsylvania State Police were not seen as your friendly local policeman by many of the students on the Penn State campus. So there was a real reluctance for students to come forward with any tips that they might have. The police were pleading for tips. They sent out letters to all the students, please tell us, and they got very little in return, and eventually the investigation just kind of petered out into a cold case.
And so now, did this Hafner have like a good family or a strong following? Did he have a lot of friends, and was he popular? Or is there certain reasons why, Lauren would not talk about it?
My suspicion is, and both of them are dead, so I can say this, but my suspicion has always been that Haefner, who was a gay pedophile himself, probably knew that Wright was also gay, and that Wright was in that day and age, in the late 1960s, Wright was probably very concerned about that being exposed, and he was scared of Haefner, and it was just a very strange relationship. I mean, Lauren Wright kept ties with Haefner to the very end of Haefner's life in 2002. It was just the only thing you can think of, when you see all this, is that Haefner had to have something on him, and so, but again, on Haefner, he was a pedophile and a very bad one. He had escaped detection or prosecution, I should say, up until 1975. There were several incidents in the 1960s that I was able to identify, some involving Boy Scouts in the troop where he was an assistant scoutmaster, others involving boys that he befriended, working essentially as a playground supervisor as a summer job in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And but for whatever reason, nobody ever followed through on prosecution. There was a different attitude toward pedophilia at that time. It was kind of almost considered more of an embarrassment than a crime. That would soon change. But I just really wonder. I look at this. There was a mother who got really upset. Haefner took two of her sons on a trip to Ocean City, Maryland, for a vacation at the end of the summer of 1965. Molested both of them, and she raised holy hell with Haefner's supervisor in the summer recreation program, but nobody ever seemingly went to the police. It was not until 1975 that Haefner was first arrested in Lancaster for molesting two boys.
Wow. How did it end for him then?
Well, he got away with it. He was in the book, I say that he was a monster, and nobody ever has really disagreed with me on that point, especially, Officer Jerry Crump, Detective Jerry Crump, who came forward after the book was published to tell me more about that 1975 arrest. But, Haefner, he was dangerous. He loved to sue people. He had discovered that it was really no great shakes to, fill out the paperwork for a civil lawsuit and sue people for damages that did something he didn't like. And he never had to win these cases, but he could harass them by forcing them to hire lawyers and respond to these cases. He kept the family of the boys that he molested in 1975 tied up in court for nearly 20 years. And I really fault the judiciary in Lancaster County for not seeing what was going on right in front of them. I mean, they would lecture him sometimes and basically say, don't file these silly lawsuits anymore, but they would never do anything serious to stop it.
Wow. So it just wasn't efficient. So now when you were doing the research, how did you research? Did you have a lot of interviews or documents? Like how did you start and go through this? Like, big process.
Yeah, it was. And this book, unlike some that I've done, was mainly based on interviews. And the reason for that was that the open records laws in Pennsylvania are very weak when it comes to accessing police records. Even in cases 40 years old like this one, it makes no difference. They don't have to release them, and they don't. And so But fortunately, I had access to Sergeant George Keebler, who was the lead investigator of the case for 14 years, and many of the other state police officers who were involved in the case in one way or the other. I talked to them. I talked to many of Betsy's friends from high school and college, and through all that, and then I was able, of course, to access the spurious lawsuits that Haefner filed over the years, and they were able to tell me other things, give me more facts and figures, and through all that, I was able to put this story together. And but it was the interviews that were the most important. And other than Sergeant Keebler, my interviews with Christopher Haefner, who was Rick Haefner's cousin, was probably the most important.
How did they respond? So how did Haefner's cousin respond? Were they kind of hostile? Were they open to it? And even the sergeant and that. How was your overall feel when you were talking to people about the story?
Well, with Sergeant Keebler, he had initially, when I was doing the newspaper articles that preceded the book by a couple of years, he had declined to talk to me. And I was a little bit upset about it at the time, but I had a story to write, so I just kind of moved past it. Now, it was funny, after the stories appeared, and I sent him copies just, so he could see what I had written. I get a call one day, this was maybe 2 weeks after the stories appeared, and he said, well, you did a real good job on that, and if you ever want to do anything more, with this, I'll be happy to talk to you. And that's almost like his voice was, and he said, and I said, so if I was going to write a book, you would talk to me? Yes, I would. And so I interviewed him 6 or 7 times at length, and he was very forthcoming. There were a couple of things that he wouldn't talk to. He would, even this, 40 years on, he would honor confidences that he had made to people who were involved in some way in the investigation, and I can't criticize him, for that. But generally he was very cooperative. And Christopher Haefner, he was an interesting person. He had been molested by his cousin at one point, and so he, in one breath he would talk about what a monster his cousin was, and in the next breath he would talk about what a genius he was. What a fun guy to be around. It was Haefner. Rick Haefner was a classic pedophile in the sense that he groomed his victims, and he would he would do fun things with these kids before the bill came due, so to speak. And so Chris was very forthcoming. I do wonder now whether he wishes he hadn't been. He's told me a couple times that other members of his extended family, were very angry with him for speaking out, and which is why I praise him in the book for his courage in coming forward.
Yeah. Were you ever able to talk to any of the family of the victim?
Mostly no. And the immediate Aardsma family would not talk to me in any way, shape, or form. Her brother was quite hostile, about it. I had really thought, that since I was a homeboy, so to speak, I was from the same town, the same culture as them, I talked in the same way, that they would feel comfortable talking to me as all of her friends did. And, but no, they would not say a word. The only members of the extended family that I was able to talk to was her sister's ex-husband, who was helpful in a couple of specific ways. He was very helpful, and then one cousin who had known Betsy very well and who had actually flown Mr. and Mrs. Aardsma, down to Chicago from Holland when they flew out to State College to bring her body home.
Wow. Well, it's how did how did the college itself or the University of Penn State feel Like, what was their thought on it? Like, what were people talking about at the time or even after? Did they really understand what happened?
I mean, they understood it, of course, in the sense that, a co-ed had been murdered in the library, which was a shocking and horrifying event, to be sure. But they also very definitely saw this as a major public relations problem, and their response to the murder was kind of a combination of wanting it to be solved, but also wanting to limit, the public relations downside, to the college. The state troopers who were involved in the investigation very much sensed that. They would say, well, yeah, they were helpful on this, but not on that, and so. And I think, tellingly, you can't find any of the documents that the college generated on its own regarding the investigation. I went to the college archives, and there was one thin folder containing mostly press releases and news clippings, about the Aardsma murder investigation. There should have been 3 feet of documents, and I'm not exaggerating on that. I mean, I've done archival research, for a long, long time, and I know how institutions respond to events like this. There should have been, memos out the wazoo, about this and that. I mean, you had 40 state troopers on campus, for 6 weeks, interviewing 2,500 to 3,000, students and faculty. I mean, there should have been just reports on, hey, what's going on? What are they finding? What are they asking about? None of that was there. And I asked where it was, and just got blank stares. It was to me, it was fairly clear that at some point those documents had been segregated and put wherever. I doubt if they were destroyed. I think they're probably, in a secure location someplace.
So you figure that they actually did have the documents, they just didn't.
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, for example, the college president at the time was Eric Walker. He wrote memos about everything, memos to the file about everything. He wrote memos about the weather. He wrote memos about the SDS picketing Navy recruiters on campus. Yet there was nothing in his file, no memo to the file about anything regarding the Aardsma case. And he never, as far as we know, he never even sent condolences to the family. I mean, I looked, there were condolence letters to maybe a half dozen, people, from outside the campus during the 3 months after the murder, not to the Aardsma family, who incidentally did complain to a reporter, perhaps 20 years after the crime about how coldly they had been treated by the university.
Wow. Not a good thing. So now how did you take in the writing of the book? So how did you what direction did you take with the plot?
Well, I always, that's a complicated question because it's probably the most important decision that a writer makes is how to organize the book. And I decided that I had to get right into the murder itself at first, and in the initial investigation. Then I decided, well, let's talk some about Betsy's background, about her young life, and how she ended up at Penn State. Then go back to the investigation, and then go into to Rick Haefner. So that's how I ended up organizing it.
Right,
and that thought went into that, believe me.
Oh, okay. And so did you find out any new information? Were you surprised by anything that you found out when you were doing this?
You mean in the research in general, or in organizing the book?
In the research itself.
Well, certainly one of the the big things that was surprising was the fact that the whole thing about how Lauren Wright had shown up at his dean's office, Charlie Hostler's, and poured out this story. I mean, Hostler, told me the story on a couple of occasions, and so there was that, and also the fact that Lauren Wright had told people about Haefner throughout his life, and I was able to nail down a couple of specific incidents where he had he had told, like former students, like Dan Stevens was one who had run into Lauren Wright in the early 1990s at a geology conference in Nevada. And Dan Stevens had spent several months with Lauren Wright and Rick Haefner out at their geology research station in near Shoshone, California, in Death Valley. And so he knew Rick Haefner, but he had heard nothing about the murder at that point, or anything about Rick Haefner, since that fall that he had spent with him. And so he told me, he asked Lauren Wright, well, hey, what's up with Rick Haefner? And he said this funny expression came over Lauren Wright's face, and then he started pouring out the story about Haefner showing up at his house an hour after the murder and various other things, so that was certainly one of the interesting things I found, plus the fact that they had essentially maintained a relationship of sorts, right up until Haefner died in 2002.
Wow. And so this was never taken to trial. No one was ever convicted of this. It just it's kind of just passed and done.
It did. It was a cold case, and there was always a cold case officer, assigned to it, but there was never any push. And one of the things I blame for that is the fact that Betsy Aardsma was from Michigan and not from Pennsylvania. She had no family in Pennsylvania, who could say, hey, what the heck's going on? Why aren't you solving this case? And the Aardsma family, for whatever reason, they just kind of went on with their lives. Sergeant Keebler said that he would, once in a while, he would call them just to let, maybe once a year, call them to let them know, what had been going on with the investigation, but they never called him, not even once. And, I sometimes wonder, and I have no proof of this, but I really wonder sometimes if Penn State reached a settlement with them early on with a confidentiality agreement. That would explain a whole lot of things. But again, that's just an educated guess on my part.
Yeah. It's always, it's really tough to find out something so long ago.
It is. Yeah.
So, do you have an overall opinion about that? Is that kind of how you've resolved it? That he probably did did the murder, and they just.
Well, I believe that he did commit the murder. He had obviously told his mother about it at some point. His mother was a real piece of work too. And there was the incident in 1975, the day after he had been arrested for molesting the two boys. He was out on bail, and there had been a couple of small articles in the Lancaster newspapers, about his arrest, and his mother was furious. And she saw him, out in the alleyway next to their house. There was an alleyway between the house and this big garage where he maintained his what he called the rock shop, where he would make these rock and mineral sample boxes that he sold to the Smithsonian. And anyway, he's out there, and his mother comes storming out, and she says, "You're doing this again. Why don't you just kill me the way you killed her?" And unbeknownst to either of them, Chris Haefner was behind the door and heard everything, and so that was one of the things that he talked to me about when we spoke, was about how, his aunt had kind of blurted all this out, and how Haefner, his cousin, didn't deny anything, and then spent the next few weeks trying to persuade him that he hadn't heard what he knew he had heard.
Yeah.
And Chris was just 15 at the time, and he didn't go to the police. He didn't know anything, and again, he had this complicated relationship with Rick, where sometimes Rick was nice, and then one time Rick was not so nice.
Yeah. Wow. So now, and it's exciting here. I see that you've got your book now coming out, or it just came out on audio, didn't it?
Yes, it did. It's available from Audible.com, from Amazon.com, or from the Apple iTunes store as a unabridged 15.5-hour digital download.
That's pretty cool. Did you have someone special do the voiceovers?
Yes, ACX, which is the entity of Amazon that produced publishes the audiobook. they have a process where you can audition potential narrators, for your book. You just put out a sample of the book for them to read as an audition, and then you decide based on that. And I got about 7 or 8 auditions, I think it was, and the one I liked the best was from Eddie Frierson, who was a veteran Hollywood voice actor. I mean, Eddie has been, you can hear his voice in Bruce Almighty, in Frozen, in Secretariat, and any number of other, movies and TV shows. You never see him, but you hear little bits of him, here and there. He's made a very good career out of that. And I really came to like his voice. I mean, I never got tired of it. He knew how to put emphasis in the right places, and he knew that, and plus he was a total pro. I mean, I never had to worry about him not getting the job done. He knew how to record, how to correct recordings, all that stuff, and just made my side of the job a whole lot easier.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's a really, really good feature. So where do you see yourself going now? What's up next for you?
Well, I started work on a new true crime book. Don't want to get into too many details yet because it's not under contract as I speak. But it's about a man who was imprisoned in Pennsylvania for 24 years for the arson murder of his daughter, and his conviction was pretty much based on what's now considered to be junk science on in the arson investigation community. But it took that long, and they knew this early on, but it still took them all that time to get him out of prison. It's a great legal thriller. It's a great story of human perseverance and faith, and I think it's going to make another great book.
Oh yeah, it sounds like it. You know what? Do you have an overall opinion, like a newer opinion? Has it changed since doing the book and the research as before on how policing and the whole system is working?
Well,
I mean, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I mean, we just had Diane Fanning on, and I know she's done a lot of cases, and it seems to be a lot of, and I'm not picking on police, but and judges and all that, but there seems to be a lot of, things that happen wrong, and then the follow-up doesn't seem to be very swift, if at all.
Yeah. I think back, certainly in the late 1960s, when the Aardsma murder occurred, and in even into the early 1990s, when the current murder I'm interested in occurred, policing was not as good as it is today. I mean, they did not have DNA evidence to work with, and they were often not that well equipped to do forensic investigation. And I mean, there's a great story in the Betsy Aardsma book about how they brought in this little old lady chemistry professor from Penn State to do their forensic work because they knew she was really good and their guys were not so good. So it's just policing, I think, in general has gotten a whole lot better, especially on the scientific and technical end.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, and how do people get a hold of you?
Well, they can find my website, daviddekok.com. That's DAVIDDEKOK.com. My email address is ddekok@verizon.net. And, that's probably the best way. And, my book, the book can be purchased anywhere you can find books. I mean, certainly Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, or any good online source would have it right away, or you could get your local independent bookstore to order it in for you.
Do you plan on doing any book signings, or are you doing anything coming up?
I don't have anything scheduled right now, not until probably the spring, but and that's actually for my Centralia book, not for this one. But so no, nothing right now. Always open to the idea, but no.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you very much for taking some time to just get to know us and talk about your book and kind of what you're doing.
You're welcome. I'm really happy to be able to talk to you.
mission has been completed.
The end. By George, he's got it. It is the end.
I'll say it.
This has been a production of the Z-Talk Radio Network.
If you're lying to me, I'll be back.